What's up, everybody? Today, I'm glad to welcome Bob to the Yours Truly virtual studio. Back in March, early March, I got a direct message over on X that read, "Hey, just want to say thank you for replying to the YouTube comment and also for the great interviews." From a profile simply titled Bob with two Chinese characters next to the name. The conversation continued. "Bob, thanks for taking a minute to connect. How long have you been tuning in? This corner of the internet? I've been watching PVK stuff since 2019. I first encountered PVK through Theology and the Raw podcast interview in March of 2019. I knew Jordan Peterson a bit before, but he was not as big of a phenomenon in China. That is where I was and am, as it was in the West. But through PVK's channel, I developed more interest in the biblical lectures, and then it led me to Jonathan Peugeot and Bishop Barron in this corner of the internet." I said, "Incredible how these things happen. Are you Chinese?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Would you be willing to have a conversation on my podcast?" And he said, "Definitely. I'm going to the States in July. What would be a good time for you?" And 4 months later, here we are. This is an example of how YouTube, Paul Vanderklay, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, Bishop Barron are all you need to know in order to start having a conversation with somebody. The hard part is first finding out if someone else understands or has been deeply impacted by these figures or persons. Bob and I haven't exchanged much other than the dialogue we had via the Twitter DM. So I look forward to seeing where this conversation leads us today. If this video is helpful, give it a like. If you want to keep up with the channel, hit subscribe. And if you're interested in supporting this channel, consider one of 3 channel membership tiers. Top tier members gain a voice to help build this little corner of the internet. So check them out. I honestly do not know where this conversation will lead us today, but with the foundation of the people previously mentioned, I know it takes us to a place of deep meaning for a person. And that's exactly the place I enjoy meeting a person at. To practice conversation craft and think out loud here on the Yours Truly podcast. So without any further delay, I give you Bob, the Chinese Rando.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.
Hey man, we're recording.
Yes.
Well,
Thanks again for inviting me.
Yeah, you're welcome, dude. It was like I was telling you backstage, I was like, you sent me the message, I guess last week. You're like, "Hey, I'm in the States." I'm like, "Oh man, yeah, I forgot all about this. Let's get this thing on the calendar."
Yeah.
And here we are. So you gave me that brief introduction of kind of how you came into this space. And you kind of initially latched on to Paul Vanderklay. So you in that 2019, so that's getting to be like 5 years ago.
Mhm.
And so how did you what made you interested in Paul's videos and his stuff?
So around about late 2018 and early 2019, and first of all, I'm working currently at a high school in China. It's more of an international department at the Chinese local public high school. And back then we have other colleagues from the States. So around 2018, I think Jordan Peterson was a big phenomenon in the US. And then one of his most famous interviews with Kathy Newman on BBC was out. So everybody around me was talking about that. So we watched something about Jordan Peterson around that time, but he wasn't big around that time until I heard an interview in Theology in the Raw by Preston Sprinkle with Paul Vanderklay. And I was like, maybe there's something else about this phenomenon and even Paul Vanderklay that it seems to attract me around that time. So then it just started the journey around since 2019.
Okay, so what was it? So you were already watching like theology. So like, are you a Christian?
Yeah.
How's that what's that journey been like for you in your life?
So around 2011, I studied at the Johns Hopkins Center in Nanjing, which is the city I live in. So it's a joint program that made up by Chinese students and American students. So it's like a cultural exchange. But in that center, we learn one of the three things. Either it's international law, international economics, or international politics. So around that time, I started to have a lot of intellectual conversations with my American classmates. One of them were Christian. And then we were talking about different cultures and stuff. And he was like, there's something about what he said and something about who he is. Really, I couldn't articulate back then, but there's something that is attractive to me. I wanted to pursue that. And so we started having conversations, and then the conversation it almost like a dialogos. That's how I would describe it using Vervaeke's terms. It just go long and long and long, and you come out of that conversation and you're like, I actually feel really good about it. I learned a lot, and there's something powerful about those conversations. And then he said all who he is because of Christ. And I got interested. I was like, I want to know who that Christ is. And then just one thing leads to another. We started to do Bible studies, and we spent around 3 years on the book of Luke.
Wow.
So that's how deep, we usually just open up with one verse, and I would hit that verse with all kinds of questions, and he would lead me to different parts of the scripture, and the conversation just grows from there. And that's our typical Bible study. And oftentimes they're just one or two verses each night, but the conversation just so vibrant, alive. And that's how I got here. And about a year, it reached to a point that my friend who led the Bible study asked me, where are you? Where are you with Christ? So I was hesitating. I was like, I don't know. And he's like, you're not there. You're not ready. And he's like, it's okay if you're not ready, but just be honest about it. I'm like, yeah, I know. So I've been praying around that time, and then I just feel the sense of someone was knocking on my door in my heart. It's like, what are you waiting for? And then strangely, that the 3 days around that time, all the conversation I have had, no matter which topic I was talking about with other people, it always ended so strange. It always ended with, what do you actually believe? What do you actually believe? Which to me is constantly knocking from God's side to me. I'm like, it never happened to me before. And I know at around that point, I just know I either gonna dive right in or completely shut the door. So at one night, at the end of the 3 days, I just said, I don't want to run away. I don't know what it is, but I want to dive in. I know this sense of growth and closeness and intimacy with you, God. And I don't want to give that up. I cannot lie. So that's how I became a Christian.
Wow. That's amazing. So in your life, was he the first or your first contact with the ideas about Christianity?
Yeah,
Your friend?
we have other. I've seen other people in China that are Christians, but he was the first one who kind of invested in my life and sit down with my questions very seriously. And weirdly, strangely, I see that side in Jordan Peterson too. Like I remember you asked this question on Twitter that some kind of what you learn from Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and that stuff. I don't remember what the exact question was, but I was thinking there's something existential about Jordan Peterson that's really attractive to me. Like when he was talking about something, he's not just giving you an academic answer that's not related to anything about his life. You feel like his whole being was pushed against what he's studying. So I had that sense with that friend who led me to Christ from the beginning. So that's how Jordan Peterson inspired me in that way. Like I was listening to his stuff, and I feel like if I don't think he is a believer yet, but if someone like him can see the biblical literature that seriously with that posture, what about believers? What about believers like us? How much more should we position ourselves against the biblical narrative and literature with that existential mentality? So,
Do you think there's a difference between looking at the biblical literature as only the literature, or from also like the symbolic framework that he or kind of Peugeot kind of, not maybe the first people to add that to it, but like reintroduce that to a lot of people's minds? You think that those things are one or separate, or I don't know if I know exactly what I'm asking, but
are you saying if I think Jordan Peterson's approach is the same as Peugeot's, or?
No, I'm saying, I guess he, from my perspective and my being in the American West, Christianity for most of all my life, really, that he did bring another perspective to the literature than the one that had kind of been given and been pervasive for all my life that I had experienced. And that's a little, that itself is a different posture, even for many Christians and people that weren't Christians that were taking towards scripture as well. I guess that's kind of what I was saying, is that sometimes the idea of where I come from, when you talk about taking the Bible seriously, it partners itself with, don't look at anything else. Only look, like, don't let anything else inform scripture. Only look at the scripture. And if you do that, then it kind of sometimes leads to a myopic experience with scripture, I guess, in a certain way. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
yeah, to me, his approach and probably Peugeot's approach were very helpful, and it just add another frame to the depth of the biblical literature. Like that frame was helpful if you stuck in certain frame.
Yes.
And that frame cannot offer you anything else anymore. And I think a lot of people are attracted to that because they don't want to give up, but they are struggling to find a different frame to offer them the meaning they cannot no longer extract from their current frame. But for me, that frame was offered within a posture of using everything, both by his intellect, but his also his life experience and everything. So I think for me, it just opens doors in a way that if I'm using that, if I'm putting my intellect, my life experience, and everything I have that God has given me into the test of holding that against the biblical literature, I will get something too. I don't have to rely on that one frame to get every meaning out of it. I can do something different than what Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau was doing by learning from not only the results, the fruit, but also how they produce it, where they come from, and the whole process of it. I think that's also interesting about John Vervaeke. Like, I think I watched his After Socrates, would you call it course or classes? It just opened me up to new ways of reading Bible. Like, I'm reading Bible in English and Chinese, and those are two different languages. And sometimes different languages give you different feels in certain things. I will give you an example. Psalm 88, the closing line, if I remember correctly, in English is, "The darkness is my closest friend," which is a really extraordinary, abnormal statement for a psalm. So that's in English, but in Chinese, it's different. If I would translate that into English, it would be, "All the people I know faded in darkness." So those are two different lines. But if you think about it, it kind of gives you a visual imagery of, so all the people I know faded into darkness. Now darkness is my closest friend. So I feel with the help of Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke, they provided for me a new framework of getting close into contact with the scripture, to the point that I can use it in my own context. Like, I'm reading both translations and they're talking with each other and they're adding onto each other to the point that they help me to understand what's really going on there more clearly. So
that's like,
I don't know if that makes
like
sense to you.
Opponent processing with the scripture.
Yes.
That's pretty cool. It's very cool. You kept using the term "the frame," and I just had a conversation. It'll release before this one by artist producer who's been influenced by Peterson and Pageau. His name's Matt Hylam, and he has a new album that just came out called "The Frame," and that's like the actual. And he I guess it's a very similar thing, that he's viewing these things through life, through these frames that help inform his art, actually. And he's got a song called Muses, and like all these people that you've talked about, people even like Ian McGilchrist. Have you heard of Ian McGilchrist? Yeah. So like he's got those are his muses for his music. So that's really cool. And that you're bringing those in, that makes a lot of sense. The Vervaeke thing is really interesting, I think, because in a different way than Peterson, especially now, he's outside of, Christianity. A lot of people in this space do believe that his frame is helpful to their faith, as you kind of start to talk. And I'm curious, being from the East, like, because so much of what like kind of Eastern practices inform a lot of his life now, with like Tai Chi. Do you recognize that the kind of Eastern influence, somebody that's from Eastern world?
Vervaeke's seem to me like I think the philosophical Silk Road kind of describe him perfectly for me. It's like, if you want to pin him into a certain room, you're missing a big part of him. He belonged to that road, or C.S. Lewis hallway. That's where he is. And from my perspective, I see him not east, not west. Like, it's hard to pin him into an Eastern framework, because he is also very articulate propositionally like smart, intelligent in that manner. But he's not that West as well. If you think about his practices, the way he do all those meditations, Tai Chi and stuff. So he's a strange person in a good way. That's how I would describe it.
Tell me more about like your environment, about what it means to encounter this stuff in China. I know you're from. What was the city you said that you're from?
It's a city called Nanjing.
So
it was famous for the Japanese invasion. There are famous books about it. I think Jordan Peterson also talked about that. There's a famous book called The Rape of Nanking. So it's talking about one of the greatest human evil around 20th century. So that's where I live in. So you can see there's a lot of generational and historical trauma in that city. And then weirdly, that was also the capital of the Nationalist Party. So the leader of the Nationalist Party all had Christian faith. So weirdly, that city also have a very hidden Christian lineage or legacy, if you would call it. If I remember correctly, the city also have the biggest printer company for the largest amount of the Bible in the world. So that's the city I live in. So it has the both end side of like trauma, but also Christ in that sense. So it's an interesting place to live. And how I got into all those was because so around 2018 I got into apologetics because I feel this like a sense of lack, sense of I don't know how to talk with someone who don't believe in God. I don't know how to share my faith without being looked as unintelligent and unintellectually intelligent. So I was diving into a lot of apologetic stuff, like Ravi Zacharias and William Lane Craig. And after a while, I just find that nobody talks in real life like William Lane Craig, if you know what I'm talking about. Like,
I do.
Nobody really, everyday Chinese people do not have the patience to sit to listen to the cosmological argument. So the more I try that approach, the more I learn that approach, the more I feel disconnected with other people and other people in the culture. And I realized around that point that I don't think a lot of Chinese people are atheists. Like a lot of apologetics around that time was talking about or were targeting new atheists.
Yes.
But I feel a lot of Chinese people, they're secular, but they're not atheists. They believe in a lot of things. So there's something disconnect in that approach. And then I heard Jordan Peterson. I was like, there's something different. He's not a Christian to begin with, but there's something different in his approach, in how he talk about all those things with other people than all the apologists that I've seen. And there's something to learn. And I don't know what to learn. So I heard that from I heard almost exactly the same thing from the Theology in the Raw podcast with Paul Vanderklay. That's exactly how Paul was getting into this. And then I saw him processing all those things on the internet. That actually gave me a little bit clarity of okay, that's how it goes and stuff. And then the pandemic hits, and that's when I think that's also around the time that Peterson was really sick, and I'm stuck in China, and the world, the environment around me kind of stopped. And I think around that time, it's those YouTube videos that kind of helped me process all the stuff around me as well. It's also, it's not only just intellectually like edifying, but it's more like it feels like you're connected with something and someone. That's why many times when Paul Vanderklay has like a messy video, I will usually comment it on saying I love those videos the most, because I feel those are the videos that I often see during the pandemic, that it seems like he was trying to use the video to work something out. You can see the whole process, and that was the process I was in during my 3-year pandemic in China. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, that's excellent. I love the way that you explained like Paul's work in reference to his synthesis with Peterson, but also with the culture, but even the humanity of how he was doing it was something during a very dehumanizing period of our history. Even through the digital space, there was like this thread that you were connected to on that, because not only did you have the context for who and what he was talking about, but it was also the fact that he, even if he had some fumbles, it was like, yeah, it's not overly produced. You can find that everywhere. That's not really what I'm hungry for. I can't spend all my hours of the day that I'm not really doing much, looking at fiction like that. And then I guess even during that time, he was also doing like rando conversations as well. Were you into those? Some?
I really like his earlier Rando Conversations before he gets this popular. I find his earlier Rando Conversations, there are some really genuine struggling people that just opened up and being honest about that. I don't remember the names, but I remember those earlier Rando Conversations actually brought me a lot of like deep, there's a deep resonance between those conversations and how the way that I watched it. It's the same as I really love the early Jordan Peterson conversation. That one, right after he got better, he had one conversation with Jonathan Pageau. That one was deeply touching for me. Yeah. Like I contrast that with the ones that he did with Bishop Barron and Sam Harris. I think the one he did with Sam Harris and Bishop Barron are very similar in the sense of both parties have a very locked in framework. They almost seem like they're not talking with each other. They're in the presence with each other to talk with the public. Mm-hmm. But the early one with Jonathan Pageau, you can see he was struggling with something. And Jonathan Pageau was more being a friend to him. And that sincerity and genuineness, like I just feel like that was really empowering to me.
It is. I mean, Peterson was, coming off from being so sick. I mean, you can even tell in his countenance how he did not look healthy yet. When you're in that state, you're vulnerable and you're emotional, even because and you know, but they decided to have that conversation, and he was even then really wrestling with faith, I guess you could say. And it's interesting when you talk about like Barron or Harris and you, these guys, when they get into kind of an ideological framework, or even kind of this old, it's an older conversation now for, how old are you, Bob?
I'm 35.
So it's beginning to be an older conversation for myself and yourself, like even how you were saying that the apologetic conversation coming into William Lane Craig in like 2018, that conversation is like a 20-year-old 30-year-old conversation that has kind of done what it needed to do, which was meet the the scientific fundamentalist and the Christian fundamentalist. They had to have the war of ideas, and that war has, I think, even if you've watched the conversation between Chris Williamson and Alex O'Connor this week.
Yeah, I did yesterday.
Yeah, so I was watching it at the same time, and that conversation represents a huge shift from what it means for atheists to talk about Christianity. I think that conversation is extremely important because you had two atheists. They weren't arguing that was like a passe to try to have the argument about, they're like, well, let's talk about the moral realities of this, or the personal realities of the way Alex talked about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and even how that drew Chris in to talk. It was like they were talking about kind of like a randos conversation between friends, between Ayaan and Richard Dawkins. And it's like, dude, they were like, you're stepping out of the friendship when you kind of do what you ask her about the virgin birth. Like, it's like it's crazy to watch from my perspective, because like pre-2010, I was watching a lot of apologetics around 2010. Like, that was a big part of my life. And so for two atheists to sit there and talk about that, which was always my beef with the whole argument, was like when it would just evolve into ad hominem, it was like, ugh. And these guys are kind of like having the same reaction. And it's like, that's a more human reaction, I guess you could say, or something. And it's transcending the ideological to something else. And I think that's really fascinating. And that was kind of what you were pointing to, it sounds like, in that difference of what you ran into listening to William Lane Craig, he's a brilliant man. And I think his work was important because it had those questions had to be addressed. They just had to be, but they aren't the only questions. They aren't the only problems that we face, and I think you've been hitting on that, articulating that really well. And it's interesting for you to make that distinction between Chinese culture not really being atheist, but being secular. And they believe in a lot of things, a lot of probably quote unquote irrational things or something, that. And so the conversation isn't even the conversation. I think that's so fascinating. And so have you been able to have different conversations as a result of listening to these other people, with friends and people that you're around?
Yeah, I think I try to apply what I learned from Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, even you in this corner of the internet. I don't engage much online, simply because of like the work, the time, and I don't have that lot of time online. I'm trying to apply similar approach to my students, that I feel my students sometimes are my randos, that a lot of times I don't know the education in the States, but in China, it's very heavily on memorization. It feels like a teacher's role is always teaching some kind of content. It always feels like it's like the students are downloading content from the teacher's brain. That's how education process feel like. And there's no real connection. There's no real teacher-student relationship or friendship. So what I learned from this space, one of the big thing was how people like you and Paul, when you guys were doing interviews, you really dive into people's stories. And I think our culture, and especially our education, lost this. That we don't see human as humans anymore. At least in my setting, we see them as machines that download information and organize those information for the great test scores to get the job and the life that they want. So for me, learn this. I try to just find all sorts of ways to connect with the students. Maybe ask them questions. Maybe ask them about what they like, what they don't like. Why don't they like this? What are something that they're struggling in life? And at first, it's so countercultural. It kind of caught them off guard because they don't have someone who deeply care about them without all the other stuff, like their scores, their achievements and stuff. And then I feel that they sense a little bit of, oh, that's what it feels like, being cared by someone who is like a teacher or mentor. And then they open up to you a little bit. And then you just see things are growing and stuff. I feel that's what one of the big things that I learned in the space. And I feel you cannot have a faith conversation until you establish that type of relationship. If you do not care about them, they have no reason to care about whatever you said, the God you cared about. That's what I learned about.
The word ideology and idea, battle of ideas versus, to use Luke Thompson's phrase, personal knowing. You're speaking to that. And yeah, I think that is there was always, like I was talking about when I was watching apologetics in the same way, there's always this piece of me that was so uncomfortable. And even I'll go as far to say this, it was like part of me that's like, well, if that's what atheism has to offer, is that I don't want it, even if it's true. I would, and I think that was a piece of my faith, actually, in those times, because if not, you're just turning, like you said, you're kind of turning people into their ideas, or you're turning them into what you can give them and like download in them that, and there's big cultural forces. I wouldn't even say that the US right now is as much about memorization to get good test scores. Like, I think that the US has tried to move, they're more about cultural propagation of propaganda, in a way. I think in the United States is becoming more, we want you to have the right thoughts about these things more than getting test answers. I think that's actually a real part of where we're at in certain places. I live in a small town that's got a lot of small town country Christian values, that's not exactly the same, but I think at culture at large, there's forces like that. So it's interesting to hear that China, I mean, yeah, you've had the Cultural Revolution and you have this kind of regime in place, but they're kind of instilling that old value of the US used to actually be known for, which is achievement and, excellence and test scores and get a good kind of American dream. That's not actually being propagated in the education. So that's really interesting to hear you say that, actually. Does that make sense?
Yes. And when you were talking, one thing struck to me was the Christian value you're talking about. It seems like in the West, you're more of a post-Christian culture. Like you still are impacted by a lot of Christian values.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where the cultural Christianity conversation comes in. But we're in, like, I feel in China, we're actually a Christian culture. Like,
Yeah.
we do not have Christian value to begin with. There's no cultural or historical reference that you can point to about those like historical and theological legacy. So it always feel like they're in our cultural context, you're establishing something new. You're seeing more as an early church figure, instead of like someone who went through enlightenment and all those other stuff. So
yeah, that is a completely different stance and a different engagement. Yeah, we're becoming, even in listening to that Chris Williamson, Alex O'Connor, they talk about post-Christian England, and they actually contrast that with the West, or with the United States, which still has kind of some parts of the old Christendom intact to more or less degrees, but still like on a downward trajectory, as they were mentioning, and I guess in some ways China only has one direction it can go.
Yeah, yes. And one example I thought was funny was like in the U.S. if you're in a city and you want to go to churches, you have a lot of choices. You have lots of different denominations, a lot of different type of services.
Yeah.
But in China, it's like in a city like ours, you have only, if you want to go to a church building, you only have 2 or 3 options.
How big?
No matter where your denomination is, like, are you going or not? I don't like the liturgy. Are you going or not? I don't like the preaching. Are you going or not? That's what it comes down to. Like,
how big is your city?
It's I forgot how big it is. I know it's a city with 9 million people.
3 churches and 9 million people. 3 church buildings.
3 church buildings. There are what we call family churches, like underground churches, smaller churches.
Yeah.
But if you want to go to bigger churches, it's like there are only like 5-6 options. But also if you're a foreigner, if you're English speaking person in the in a city like ours, you only have 1 or 2 options. So
9 million,
Yep.
Is it? Wow. Perspective. Yeah, I live in a town of 10,000 and there's probably 100 churches or something like that, of flavors and whatnot. Obviously, only a few of them are, larger-ish, but man, so you're tapped into this really specific corner of the internet. Do you feel like, do you meet other people that that are paying attention to these things where you're from? Or do you feel,
I think during the pandemic, I tried to join the Discord, and then there I had a very short conversation with Graham Gris.
Yeah.
Very short. So he seemed to be a little bit interested in what I have to say, but then like life got busy, and Discord there are just a lot of conversations going on. I just find it's really hard to keep up, so I just limit my conversations on Twitter. Twitter is, I think in some way I'm very similar to Paul Vanderklay in terms of like, I use Twitter as my filing cabinet. Like, I have thoughts, I just post there. I don't have a lot of people follow me, so I don't worry about what they're gonna see and everything, how they're gonna comment. So for me, it's like, okay, here are my unedited thoughts or my initial reactions. I just posted there, just in case I forget. But I think you are the first person who actually reached out to me saying, "Hey, let's do an interview." I'm like, "Great, let's do it."
Well, it's I think some of the stuff with Paul, people would reach out to him, to see if he would. And I mean, you're the U.S. I was just with this whole thing with this podcast, I guess you could say, like, I mean, one of the things when I was watching Alan, he has been on some of Paul's streams and like Chad the Alcoholic stuff, and Paul a month or two ago, he said something like, should I continue to do randos or kind of try to do some of these other profile stuff? And he said, I think you should do randos simply for the sake of example. And that really spoke to me, like in my own journey of this. What is it? What are the important conversations? Is it only the ones that get you more clicks and status? And it's like, no, it's not. And now those are fun and interesting as well, and important. They are also important. But that, I mean, to your point, like how those rando conversations impacted you, and then even what kind of came out of Discord, where a bunch of just random conversations, but kind of like, let's make some of these will have a publicness to them, but it still is like birthed out of that. I think all those pieces, as I've come into the space, understanding what is important, what is valuable, I think that is true. And so to the effect, you reached out to me, I was like, well, this is interesting. Wait, this guy's Chinese. I wonder, I have not seen or heard Chinese people talking about this stuff. That is interesting. And like I said in the intro, it's like, well, I mean, if you can rattle off these names, and if you've watched a couple of 100 hours of these people, then we can kind of go somewhere. And, but it sounds like for you, I mean, that's part of what happened for me in this space was, even though I was in the States, like I still didn't have a lot of people to talk to about this stuff. And it all is like this conversation in your mind. Like you're saying, it's just like, and you can get it out. Like there's ways that it affects like how you're relating to your students, but it's like, it's miles downstream from the source material. And, the kind of tagline for this podcast, to be able to think out loud about these and to enter into conversation about this stuff. I think, I mean, for me, I mean, I'm doing some of it selfishly, because it's helpful to be able to process these things. And so I think that there's an immense, if all of this stuff is happening on YouTube, like for the most part, Peterson phenomenon, Paul Vanderklay ministry, Peugeot, mentioned Robert Barron. This stuff's all happening on YouTube, and it's affecting people all over the world. And that is then affecting people all over the world. And those are interesting stories. And I just think that it's like, you can only take in for so long before you need to, like, you can't always just be breathing in. You can't always just be eating. You have to digest and you have to exhale, and so I think this is a part of that. And it's a privilege to be able to maybe provide space for that, and I think the stories, like you said, the stories are like the most interesting part. I think go ahead.
Do you think that process for you to take in and let out, was that process for you organic, or is there something that's more like, I need to push myself to do this?
So because of the political nature of Jordan Peterson, like you mentioned the Kathy Newman, and then there's like the GQ interview, and like he's made a lot of political statements, but there's kind of like these different levels, like you said, there's like when he's at the level with Harris, but then there's when he transcends that into like a higher level that was resonating with you, and so for me, like there, it was I was nervous to bring him up sometimes because of the political side. It's like, how do I even say, listen, I'm not as interested. Some of that stuff makes me laugh more than it like makes me like, oh, like, yeah, rah, rah, rah. Like to get to what I think is the really central part of his meaning making, the maps of meaning stuff. And so, you chew on these things and then you look at other stuff and kind of come back. Oh, this was interesting. I'm going to look at this. And same thing happened with Paul. So Paul's talking about it. He's a Christian talking about it early on. I remember seeing like 800 subscribers when I first saw Paul, like early on. And with my story, I was also in a very isolated, keep your mouth shut type of space in my life as well. So it came to a point 7 months ago, where I was having a conversation with a friend. We were on like a double date, me and my wife, and a lot of the stuff that I was talking to him about had come from this space. Like they had gone through some hard things, and I was talking about wisdom, and I was just like, man, that's just like kind of like you're saying, you give out these kind of little pieces, whether it's to your students and I was like, so much of this came from here. And I think that very morning, that like at noon, I had seen actually for the first time, Paul opened up a live stream on his Friday afternoon live stream. And I was like, what was that? Like, I've known Paul for online for years, and I had never seen that because I wasn't like tapped into the personal layer of the corner of the internet. I didn't know it existed. And so when I saw that, I think it connected, like not being able to really communicate these ideas and not having like seeing there be personal people connected to the ideas and having dialogue was like, and 6 months before I had bought a camera, I'd built this studio for music, but the camera, I thought, oh, maybe I can try to do some video podcasting. I had recorded a podcast with a friend about just like, it was kind of I was highlighting him in some of the stuff he was doing. I actually did a conversation with him recently. His name's Bill, Bob and Bill, Bill about cycling. But I had some things transition and I kind of hit like a little bit of depression and I kind of like just set everything aside. And so when I saw that happen with Paul and I had that conversation, I was like, I turned the camera on. I just like kind of like threw some stuff together and turned the camera on and I said, I'm just going to start talking about this impact on my life. And like there was like 500 views overnight and people saying, Christian, this was meaningful. I was like, who are these people? And Chad was like, hey, you want to come on and have a conversation with me on my channel? I'm like, what just happened? So, I can't remember the exact part of your question, like the exhaling, what was it? What triggered it? That's kind of the story of what triggered all that. And then, I made like 3 or 4 or 5 like story videos of like kind of the big players. And then I just started processing some other things I had gone through. And then I just started having conversations. I was like, and it kind of was like, this is something I think that makes sense that I think I can kind of keep going with. So, but I'd already wanted to kind of do a podcast. I wanted to do creative things, but it was, I didn't know that was going to be how this played out that way. But yeah, that's kind of, go ahead.
Yeah. I watched several of your interview and I think you're so good at quickly understand someone. I heard your responses to your guests indicates you understand them really well in a very short amount of time. I don't see that for every interviewer. And that's me watching a lot of, like, I listen to a lot of podcasts and I listen to a lot of interviews. I think you're really good at doing that. I don't know do you realize that about yourself or
The only thing the thing that comes to my mind was that I spent 4.5 years almost solidly doing telehealth therapy that was basically like this. And And I was actually doing most of the talking. But what I saw and what I experienced was what it meant for somebody to listen, to really listen. Like, man, he may only say like a few things, like, you know, during the course of our hour together, but he was listening like the whole time. And that was powerful for me because I can talk a lot. Like I can get on things and go, but that was also informative. And so I don't know. I think that may be part of it. My wife is incredibly intuitive, and she's taught me a lot about I mean, she can sometimes we operate on a wavelength. Like I can barely do something and she's like, what's wrong? You know, and she's like right there. And I was like, oh man. So I think that's part of it too. But I don't, maybe I'm trying not to come at this only to be heard. I do want to express ideas, but I'm not coming like that. What's the point of trying to host somebody only for you to be heard? The interesting thing, you know, I also think that that's where the gold is like understanding the other person. That's what Joe Rogan, like, that's his treasure trove of experience is like listening to thousands of people over several hour conversation. So anyways.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Yeah, that's part of that. But thank you, by the way. Those are kind words. Kind words.
I think when you were talking, I thought of another thing I was trying to do that kind of was taking ideas from this corner of the internet was I tried to make my own estuary group in with friends who also watches Jordan Peterson, who are Christians. I was messaging them. I was like, what do you think of it? We just meet once a month and just process stuff that we in our mind and stuff. And for some reason, it just people got busy, they got sick, and it didn't work out eventually. But we did it like for like 3 or 4 times, and then there's something that changed in them that they want to do that with other people. So our group died, but then they took that idea to expand to their own context and doing more stuff with them. And I feel really happy about that.
Wow. It's so cool to hear these things, like these ideas, you know, Joe talks about the logoi going out, like the knowledge and the ideas and the goodness of God going out, and then they land and they do something, you know. And this idea, this estuary idea that you mentioned, like that kind of was Paul's and I guess John Van Donk's you know, brainchild of what can we do? How does this go out into the real world? And so like that story and that testimony, like you're like, that's cool to hear. I mean, oh, there's estuary happening in I can't remember how to say your city, Nanjing, China, yes. You know, happening. And why do you think it didn't kind of stick? Do you feel like what was kind of why did it not make sense to stick?
I think deep down, through my own experience, I think stuff like actuary would work if everyone who participate in the group are willing to sacrifice, are willing to put their guards down, like at least intellectual guards or personal emotional guards down, to trust other people in the group to
enough to invest in their time, give up their time to do that sort of thing together. It's like a wrestling match. You have to trust your opponent enough to fully wrestle with that person. I think one of the reasons it didn't work out in my context is people do not have their guards down enough. And then you see a commitment issue, and then you see people are not wrestling properly with their ideas and stuff. And then it just slowly, other things in life just took over, and you have other commitments and stuff that you always would be busy about something else. So then it became less important, and that eventually died off. But then at the same point, you're like, once you had a good wrestling match, once you feel like you're fully, like it's an embodied expression, you're fully express yourself through that practice, it's hard to let go. It's hard to just completely abandon that. Somehow you want that to happen more and more in your life.
Yep.
So
that's interesting. There's like this idea of personal responsibility and then an honesty, letting the guard down, and truth, Peterson. And then you talk about this kind of fractal reality of sacrifice. Like there's levels of sacrifice, not just the Old Testament levels of sacrifice, but like the sacrifice of your time and the sacrifice of being right in order that the other person can feel safe. And then that you can enter into a stance of this Vervaeke dialogue that allows for the opponent processing. And then it's like, oh, actually that was really instructive, or that was actually really helpful. And because I let my guard down, I was willing to hear this. And then I actually said something that the other person who disagreed with me, oh man, but to get there, I think you do have to come to some kind of end of your rope of being tired of keeping your guard up. You haven't come to that place yet. And I think that's where estuary in the United States has probably, through things like COVID and politics, people have come to the end of trying to be right. Oh, I can be right about COVID. I can be right about and it's like, man, all that has done. It's like, so maybe there's something else here, and I'm actually not even interested in those conversations right now or anymore. I'm interested in these other ones. And but you kind of have to get to that point. And I don't know, what do you think the guard is that you were maybe bumping up against in those, if you could put a kind of point at something you're saying, not wanting to be right, or like an idea? What do you think the main things were that were kind of the hurdles?
There's intellectual ego would be one.
What kind of ego?
Intellectual ego.
Okay.
The sense of, I've already spent so much time in those things. I figured out everything in me. I want to have conversation, not because I want to learn from other people, but I want to express myself. I want to share my hard work with other people only, but I'm not open to any feedback, which kind of remind me of one of your interviews. Someone asked you, I don't remember who asked you about doing an interview. You say something like you just want to learn from other people. And I feel that's the essence of doing that. It's like, if you don't have the mentality of learning through people who you think are not smart as you're not learning, and you missed it. It's not a conversation, and you will have your guard up.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest hurdle of this. And there's another hurdle, I would say, it's fear. It's a fear of being fully seen by other people.
Yeah.
And I feel, in my experience, I feel this sense of, on one side, we're deeply longing to be known by others, but on the other side, we're afraid if we're really being known by others, it will make us very vulnerable. And I feel there's an inner battle between the two in those conversations. And if that side of, I'm afraid if they really know me, they will not like me, and that will put their guard up. So those are the top two reasons I think that sabotages those type of conversation.
Intellectual ego and fear of being truly known. So the two parts of that for me, that one of them, I've mentioned Chris Williamson already, but someone said, how did you get here? Basically is like, by continually to be the dumbest person in the conversation, and accepting that, coming at this, like, I always have something to learn. And of course now he can kind of even poke, like the way he poked at Alex O'Connor a few times, because he's got some rigor attached to his years, probably almost 10 years of work, or however long he's been doing it now. But that approach, like a humility, like, so the opposite of that, to come into a conversation being like, I've always got something that I can learn. Great posture. And then the being known one. Yeah, that one's huge. And it's probably a little less, like, you can work with that one, but if you can't get over the first hurdle, you know what I mean? Like, well, okay, I'm okay with maybe being wrong here, but I'm not gonna let that, the hurdles down to C. So, but I think those are two huge ones. And the one about being known is, it made me think of something that happened yesterday, actually. So, I've been doing this 6 months on the internet, but at work, like, it's not been something, I don't advertise that I have been doing this oh, hey, check out my, I work in a hospital. It's like, but one of the people I work with, and I travel, like, I'll be at this place for like 13 weeks, and then I'm going to be at another hospital. But a few weeks ago, this girl was like, hey, I looked you up on Facebook, and I have a link to this on my Facebook account. And she's like, you have this whole podcast, it's kind of Southern girl. And she's like, so if you're listening out there, hey, but she was like, oh, this is really interesting. Okay. And she told me, I had asked her, cause she wears like scrubs instead of like leggings or something. And so she has a religious kind of commitment. At one point was a religious commitment. And I asked her about it, and she's like, no one's ever really talked to me about that, and I was like, but having been a pastor in my former career, like, I'm not unfamiliar with like these things. And so it's not a big deal. But so that was kind of like, okay, so she's seen my stuff. I wonder who else she's going to like text to people at work. Hey, look what this guy who we're working with. All right, just go about your business. Go about your business. Well, yesterday, this guy who does education at the hospital was like, he got my number because he was texting me about coming to a meeting. And on my iPhone, like, I have some, like, my profile picture is like a professional headshot or whatever. But me and my wife got some other like pictures for music stuff that we've been doing. So there's one of me holding a guitar and her. And so it's my phone number profile. So whenever he got my number, it popped this picture up. I didn't even think about it. And then a few minutes later, I look on my YouTube, and he's a new subscriber. And I was like, oh my gosh. and I was like, okay. So I just texted him. I was like, hey, you found me, or, whatever. And he was like, he's a Christian. And we kind of start talking about some stuff. He plays music at his church and different things. But it was very much, these worlds don't cross they don't cross that much. And when they were, it was like, when you're talking about the fear of being known, like, part of me has not, on my journey out of ministry and then into like the secular workspace, there was a time, there were years where I was like, I don't even want that part of me to be known anymore. That's not who I am anymore. And so I'm kind of coming into some new territory. And it is vulnerable. It's like, oh man.
Yeah.
So you brought that out of me, man. Thinking about all that. So yeah, go ahead.
As you were talking, it just remind me of a conversation I watched yesterday on your channel with Food Truck Emily. You guys were talking about worship music.
Yeah.
So I've been doing this thing in the church that I'm at because I reached to a conclusion that I feel I want real theology. I want real theology in the sense of if it's an embodied life affirmed theology. It's theology that's being lived out. So then I saw my church, and there are people who went through a lot of stuff in the in Chinese history and still remain Christian. And they are old. They're in their 70s and 80s. They went through Cultural Revolution. They went through all the ups and downs, and they didn't give up their faith. And I was like, I want to know their story. I want to know why. I want to know what type of stuff that got them got them where they are, to the point that they didn't abandon the institution. They still remain faithful in there. So I shared this idea to the pastors in the church, and they were really happy about that, because old people are actually kind of ignored in the Chinese society. They're seen as kind of outdated. They don't know the newest technology. They're kind of marginalized. So you have a young person who really want to learn from the old people. They're really happy about that. So a couple months ago, our head pastor introduced this 80-something-year-old lady to me to set up an interview, and we did some kind of other activity before. Then she came into the meeting room where we did the interview, and we started talking. It was really interesting. Before I said anything, she started by saying, I was wandering in my life for 40 years, just like Israel. Like, that's a woman who doesn't have a formal education. Like, she is not intellectually wired like I do. But the first line of her opening that interview, it kind of just struck you like, oh, I bet there's a story there. You're already anticipating there's something powerful in that thing, that she has such a rich experience that connect to the Bible, that you just feel the power in waiting that as someone who does that interview. And then she started talking about her father, and her father became a blind man at the end stage of his life. And he started writing his own worship songs. And she started pulling out this piece of paper and started singing the worship songs that his father wrote. And the songs, like, her singing is not good. But that song, there's something really powerful in that moment when she starts singing the songs that her father wrote, and just speak music to me. And all the people in the room, me and another pastor, we just sit there. We just worshiped. And I don't know, when I heard your conversation with Food Truck Emily, you were talking about worship music being kind of sometimes being like manipulated into a certain type of like experience, like an emotional experience. But for me, like, our church doesn't have like the great worship leaders that can put on a show. that kind of force you to pay attention to this type of thing. That there's a certain power in those broken, like
Melodies.
it's not melodies, and you're like, I can really hear God in this. I can really hear the Spirit. I feel the Spirit is doing something in me in that moment. Then with that 80-year-old woman singing the song that his father wrote when he got blind and 3 months before he died. And there's something powerful that music speak that connect with her life story and her father's life story, and just kind of condensed in that song. And when the lyrics was sent, it just flow in me, and there's something about me just being opened to that. And I was like, that's worship song to me. And we need more experience like that. We need to know the stories attached to those worship songs. We need to know someone who truly worship, and to be able to get that. Otherwise, we're just gonna manufacture certain experience and treat it like it's a God experience. And deep down, we all know it's not. So when I watched that part, it just brought that alive in me.
There's so many, there's pieces there. There's the marginalized elders, which Jordan Hall actually had a tweet about this like yesterday or the day before, about why is it that we have lost the idea of sage and elder in the culture. And you pointed at it's because they're not hip to the new technology and things are changing so fast. It's like, what do you really have that I don't have? And you just told us it's this history and this story and this lineage, and that the power of that like went into you, knowing the story, seeing this woman's life, and a second generation, 80-year-old second generation Christian in China. I mean, I don't know the milieu, but it seems like that's maybe not that common. And there's a lot that's like speaks to almost like a sainthood to me, like that the power of that that family faith being like passed down. And you talked about it. I mean, I explained this when I did this one video about worship, that worship is a compression of the transcendent. And then this song became an icon that you were able to see and experience through it God. And because of the intensely compressed transcendence, and you're contrasting that with something that's maybe like a compact, a manufactured kind of compression of transcendence, that we try to do. And again, that's not to completely poo on certain things. Like people, just like Emily said, that people have experiences that you don't even know that are happening. It's through all sorts of things. But I do think that contrastly, that in our culture, we don't value the aged either. I think that's a modern, more than Western, that's like a modern secular, you're out to pasture. That's a phrase, send them out to pasture. They don't have, let the wolves, like that's a part of kind of our culture now. And so many stories are lost or aren't valued because they aren't connected to the now. And I even think that whole idea of being connected to the past on a meta level too is important, that people in this space are kind of discovering, and that's kind of hitting at the appreciation for Eastern Orthodoxy and high church tradition as well. But it's not necessarily an either or. It's not, I think, like in a Vervaeke sense, it's like, if there's a rubber band between my hands, like the rubber band is actually best when it's like this, not when it's like this, or like that, one thing's pulling, but when there's the right kind of tension between the now and the history and the future. And I think that's a beautiful embodied story about that. I think we need more of that. And it reminded me of a story, like with my family, my in-laws. When I first got married, my wife's grandma moved in with her parents, and they cared for them. They cared for my wife's grandma for the last 5 or so years of her life. And I watched my mother-in-law kind of give up what was going on in her life to tend to her mother-in-law for those last, and my wife's mother was a nurse. And so it kind of made sense. And then so my wife was pregnant in the last months of my wife's grandma's life. And she kept saying, I'm gonna make it till that baby comes home, till I can hold that baby. And then we actually had our child really early, 1 pound, 14 ounces. And she was in the hospital for 3 months. And so then my wife's grandma kept saying, I'm gonna make it until that, I can hold that baby. And then I'm gonna make it till that baby comes home. And then our daughter Liv came home, and 3 days later, her grandma died. And it's like this passing of life, like she was the first grandchild in that. So that would have been her great grandma. And then like watching my in-laws care for this lady in the latter part of dignity. And it was so deeply impactful on me, like that kind of sacrifice. And those aren't the stories that we tell, those aren't they aren't sexy or beautiful or, but they're like deeply true, and they're deeply meaningful, and they're happening to everybody, but there's certain things that the culture doesn't want to face. And I think that's one of them, and something about our faith, and we already hit on like the ideas around sacrifice. They tell us that there's, kind of a different story that we can embody. And I love that you tapped into that. You saw that and gravitated towards that. Did you do any other conversations, or was that kind of the only one?
I did another one. I think early 2023. She's a teacher, elementary school teacher who worked at that church for about 30 years. And I'm thinking about details of that conversation. The one thing that stood out to me immediately in that conversation was, at the end of it, I asked, like, if you want to say one thing to my generation, the generation of this generation of believers in China, what are you going to say? Like, what kind of things you can offer, or a piece of advice or something? She said, to root yourself in the Bible. And I thought that was deeply, like, there's something about that. I've read enough like a Western Christian type of conversations about like the biblicists, the fundamentalists, how they treat the Bible. But when you have someone who wrestle with their faith for the whole life, to say, root yourself in the Bible, there's something different. And I don't know how to articulate that difference, but I know it's not just like read Bible literally and just like not those things, but more like.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No. What it sounds like to me is that first line from that other interview when she said, my life was like 40 years in the desert, like the Israel. It's like she's already talking the symbolic nature, the metaphorical reality of Scripture that was more than, that the earth is this years old. And if you say something else, then you're, like that right there articulates, I think, part of the difference. What does it mean? She's rooted herself in the story, and whether that's maybe the story of the gospel, but the story of the history that she's rooted her, that, that was a different conversation, but I'm mapping that kind of on to what I hear you talking about are trying to articulate the difference between like a biblicism versus a love for this story or something like that.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of the whole Richard Dawkins and what's her name, the Ayan Hirsi Ali. Those are two different approaches. Richard was seeing like from the outside perspective, if those truth claims and stuff, and you see Ayan Hirsi Ali position her life into that story, and that they're not having the same type of conversation. They do not see the biblical narrative the same way. They're talking about two different things.
And that's where Alex O'Connor actually is articulating that. And that's what, and there's a huge difference from the conversation that he just had with Chris Williamson from the one he had like 3 or 4 months ago. Like it was like drastically different, like his tone. And for him to start out the conversation, which you pointed out at Twitter when I said, yeah, he mentioned Justin Brierley's book, and as a friend, like in the first 5 minutes, he said it was in the first 3
minutes. Yeah.
and so that the part where he said, my friend, that the relationship is transcending the truth claims in a way. Like they do and they don't. You know what I mean? Like you have to put your faith in something, but like they're at least acknowledging that it's part of the same thing. And I love that. So what does it mean to root yourself in scripture? And then you kind of, we kind of then go into like, okay, well, I know that there's enough here to be like, there's problems with like this, Western, in the last century or two, what has developed into fundamentalism versus what this lady has just told me. There's something there. And I think, like we're kind of pointing on then into this whole conversation about, well, what it was this existential question, the way that Peterson was, bringing forth scripture in just as serious as anybody else. That was the thing. It's like, no, he's taking this serious, but he's not, it's in a different way, and it's like, okay, well, what is this way? And I also think that that's the fascinating thing about, well, one of my earliest conversations here I've referenced a lot is with Justin Wells, and he has a book called Truth in Documentary, and he articulates this this divorce that took place with the office and the sacrament of confession from the church into psychology because of Freud, and that I think that's the other piece is like reintegrating the psyche into our faith, into the wholeness of, like, it's not just this other thing that science studies out here that's separate from the person. It's like, no. Like it's always been one person, it's always been one thing, but we've tried to, in our modernist approach, take these things out and be like, no, this is something else. And we can just study this one thing by itself. And that's the best way to study it. It's actually not true. Mm-hmm. So anyway, man, yeah, I love that. The way that you kind of, you took that phrase that she had, and then you're like, and I know there's a tension here. And then you're like, and then boom. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Dude. Well, do you have anything else that you were kind of interested to bring to the conversation that we've missed?
Let me think. I don't know. What's your any of your interesting like China and Christianity in China and stuff like that? Like, is there something in there that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, so my dad is half Korean. He was born in Korea, and that's kind of, I consider this a part of my own heritage, like the East, that I don't know a lot about. I was raised in a very small rural community in Arkansas. It's like, feels like, but yet here we are having this conversation. And even though obviously there's different cultural histories from Korea and China, I still feel like that's a big, that's a part of my story that's in there somewhere, the East. And so it's a joy and an honor to be able to kind of interface with that from, as a real part of my life. And so, I mean, that would be one aspect of it. I've had friends, I guess the question I would have is, I've had friends kind of get kicked out who are missionaries in China, and this whole and what does it mean? Like it sounds like you have a good community in your church and pastors and everything, but what do you think in general it means to be a Christian in China?
That's a great question. That question immediately brought a memory of someone asked me several days ago, like, are you being fed in your community? And it kind of caught me off guard at first, but this is how I answered it. Many times when I heard this type of question, it almost put me in the position of being like a consumer in the church setting. Like, you're coming to the church, you're being fed with all those type of experiences, and you go to your regular life, and you just work with all those spiritual food or drink that you were fed with, so you have enough energy to go to your secular life. But what is interesting about China is, if you have that mentality of consumerism, you'll be hugely disappointed. Like, you will not be fed, and the worship songs are not going to be as good as you thought. The sermons are not as well crafted. Like, it especially if you consume content like Tim Keller or N.T. Wright, those type of stuff, or Bishop Barron, and you heard that sermon, you're like, are you kidding me? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so if you have that type of mentality in the church, you will be really, really disappointed with everything going on around you. But I feel that experience taught me that community always start with, like what we said before, a sacrifice. But to me, it's more like an investment. Sacrifice almost have the connotation of you cannot get any, like, you expect to get anything back. But I feel, for me, it's more like an investment. You cannot expect to get anything back unless you put yourself into it. You become part of a community. You fed other people the way that God called you to feed other people. And now there's something is going to feed you. So being a Christian in a Chinese setting, it kind of destroyed that consumer. If you really want to be a Christian, it kind of destroyed that consumeristic mentality. So that's the first thing that came to me. The second thing would be that existential approach to Christianity is vital to someone in my context. Like, that's why I remember in the conversation you did with Food Truck Emily, she mentioned she was rereading Bonhoeffer. And I'm reading Bonhoeffer. I'm reading The Cost of Discipleship. And I'm reading Bonhoeffer because, one, he's a great theologian, but two, he has that existential approach to Christianity that kind of marked his life and his theology in a certain manner. So in our context, there are two extremes. There are Christians who want to fit in with the cultural context so much that they just abandon that, the countercultural part of the gospel. They just want to fit in. They just don't want to be attacked by the culture. So there's one narrative to really try to make Christianity cultural, to make Christianity more Chinese friendly, to make it more like, oh, we're good Roman citizens, so we're good Christians, that type of thing. And there's another narrative that says all those are wrong. Like, we need to abandon all of those. All we need to do is being countercultural. When culture says yes, we say no. When culture says no, we say yes. And the martyrdom is a new idol. If we go against the culture, we must be Christ-like. So I see those two tendencies, and I feel like both are missing a big part. Both are not really the Christianity I know. I feel for the fit-in type of Christianity, it lacks that existential confrontation with Christ that the Petersonian, or even Paul Vanderklay would say, Kierkegaardian sense of like, let's step courageously to the unknown. That's the part that they're missing. Do not be afraid. And to the other side, the anti-cultural ones, it's more like, are you following Christ or are you following your own virtue? Like the virtue, are you treating all those virtues that you learn from Christianity, the Christian values, higher than Christ himself? It's weirdly like it's more of there's a hidden anger and wrath that's similar to this Christian, if I understand correctly, it's close to the Western understanding of Christian nationalism. It's like, we need to win. We need to win this anti-cultural way so that the whole world will be ours, that sense. So those are the second part of being a Christian in China that I feel, those are the things that we're bumping up against. And the third thing is I just lost my thoughts. I think you just have you watched the movie A Hidden Life?
No, but
Terrence Malick?
I saw you post it on Twitter. I was looking at your Twitter today. I need to.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite. It just captures so well. It's not really about the words. Yeah, we evangelize with our words, but it's more like how we position our life in a certain manner that to some people in the world, it's like hidden, but to the other people in the world, it's like there's beauty shining in those type of things. And I feel that's the Christianity in China that I devote myself to. And yeah, so far that's what I'm thinking.
So there were three things. One is this kind of, the framing that we would use here, seeker movement versus kind of the culture fundamentalism, like how can we meet the culture where it's at, and we used to call that contextualizing the gospel. And then the fundamentalist approach of like anti-culture versus culture. Seen that play out here. So it's really interesting to hear those same tensions rising up. And yet here's this other thing that you're talking about, which to me, it's where you're meeting me at, as I've lived in one way or shape or another within those two, that's like here. And there's actually something else like that when you talk about this existential connection to God, is to me, it's something about transcending that level and with like Integral Theory by I can't remember the author that put out, but my conversation with James Taylor Foreman that just released, that was something when he talked about in his Substack about why I am a Christian again. He kind of framed that we get stuck in these different places, and that those two things are actually, be the culture or anti-culture, are actually like in the same thing. And that that we have to actually transcend that to where we can come into a unity of our sacred existential leap of faith, that Kierkegaardian leap of faith that you were mentioning, like, which if we can find, like, because even in this, the anti-culture, culture connection, it's like all across the spectrum of anything from Christian nationalism to affirming this X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C, like, or trying to just fit into the mushy middle. Like, we want to be like bubblegum Christian. They're all like in the same place. And that is where I've been trying to understand how, in certain parts of our history, but also certain parts of trying to go forward in approaching the sacred part of our faith. And right now, I mean, you touched on it whenever you talked about that story with the elder lady in your church, and it's like you're like this is like a sacred thing you're experiencing, you know, this song given to her in the last 3 months of her father's life, and here she is now 80 years old. It's like offering it to you. And then you talked about the difference between sacrifice and investment too, and that really is what Peterson defines sacrifice as, is like you're giving up something for the future. And that something about the entering into that mindset and that approach and finding a way to, I mean, churches have tried to find ways to formalize this, you know, and it is always at the altar, whether that is an altar call, like in the Baptist way, or that is the altar, the table of sacrifice, all the way up to the Eucharist. Like, we are aiming at that sacred leap of faith in that culture, and trying to get that to be the point that we really, like, at least in our gathered time of worship, that we are putting our attention to not to someone, I'm consuming the information so that I know that he agrees with me and I'm right and all this stuff, and not on an objective level of like, was the music good or not good? Was I like that? There's something else that we're aiming at in that gathered time. And I do think it has something to do with the altar and sacrifice. Mm-hmm. But well, man, it's hard to know how to communicate that explicitly. A lot of it is just kind of this implicit, implied thing that we know that we were aiming at, but we don't know how to sometimes move it out of this. We're always trying to look for this silver bullet down here somewhere else. So I don't know, man. That's how I hear that. Before we get going, any other kind of response on that, on that stuff?
It kind of remind me of, it's almost like, I'm paraphrasing Bonhoeffer, and I read it in Chinese translation. He was talking about, after you become a Christian, you do not have the direct touch with the world anymore. You always touch the world through Christ. You always go through everything through the mediation of Christ. And so in that sense, you do not touch culture directly anymore. It's not you engage the culture. It's you engage the culture in the mediation of Christ. What it spoke to me, what that means was there are two things will happen in you, that your engagement with the culture that you're dealing with always will go through a crucified Christ shape. And also, the Christ engagement with a culture through you will go through a U shape. So it's still you engage with the culture. It's the fruit we produce from the branch of you, but it's also the fruit was coming from Christ. So how does that work? I don't know. How are we doing perfectly all the time? Probably not. But I feel ideally or supposedly that's the way it's supposed to work. And I don't know if there would be a perfect formula for articulating those type of things. Just like there's this gardening metaphor or analogy came to my mind. It's like it's not that strict in the sense of you should do this and you should do that and this will happen. It's not a carpeting project that the end project is so standardized that you just see it and you can duplicate that process all the time. It's more like you're a gardener and things will happen organically if you provided the sunshine, the rain, the fertilizer and stuff. And how they're going to grow in all sorts of crazy directions that needs pruning and needs reshaping every now and then. But it's like it grow in an organic matter. It just feel like natural, those type of things, when those type of things happen. It's also reminds me of your response when I asked you, like, did this thing that happened to you, just the breathing in and breathing out, the taking in of this corner of internet and just serving it back to and reach out to more people like me, is it natural for you? And your response struck me like, yeah, it is. It would be unnatural to not do that type of thing. It still need to be pushed a little bit to a certain point. But again, it feels right. It feels something supposed to happen. It almost feels wrong if you don't do those things. You would miss more. So when you say those type of things, this came to my mind.
Wow. I love that image of the garden, of tending to and caring. Like, it takes me back to Jonathan Peugeot's speech at ARC. The world is built on more than basically science, scientific endeavor. It's built on things like care and attention. And until we recognize that, we're going to continue to deal with a lot of problems. And that picture of caring and attending to that bush or that garden, or that plant, but it's not something that you can control and that fits into a box. It grows on its own into something right and true and beautiful and good. And man, I think that's profound. And what really matters is the fact that you're giving it care and that you're giving it attention and love even. And man, I think that's an awesome place to kind of put a period on this conversation, and hope that it makes sense to do another one in the future. So
yeah,
Bob, thank you for reaching out. And this was, I didn't have a lot of expectation because I didn't know, but it totally blew it out of the water and exceeded my expectation. I can tell you that. So
it all started with your invitation. It started somewhere, and yeah,
it all starts with an invitation. Yes.
Yep.
All right, man. Hang around and we'll end this thing backstage. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in and staying with us until the end of today's episode. Your support and digital connection are truly meaningful to me. If you've enjoyed today's conversation and believe that these discussions bring real value to your life, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Your feedback and interaction are crucial in making this space even more meaningful. Also, I've opened up channel memberships on YouTube. By joining, we can foster a stronger community of connection and support the continuation of more conversation craft. Membership is set up to foster this in 3 ways. Level 1, connect via members-only community posts for channel feedback, behind-the-scenes moments, and supportive membership branding on comments. In addition, level 2, get to watch podcasts a week before they air, along with other unique members-only videos. At level 3, join scheduled monthly focused small group discussions with other kindred spirits from all over the world. Thank you again for being a part of this journey. Together, we can cultivate meaningful, supportive digital community right here in this little corner of the internet. We'll see you next time.